My parents promised me the family business when they retired. The day they retired, they handed it to my younger brother and told me I'd misunderstood. 30 years building something together, and the day it mattered most, they looked me in the eye and said I must have imagined the whole thing. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 47 years old. When I was 18 years old, I turned down a college scholarship to join my father's landscaping company. Not because I had to, because my father sat across from me at our kitchen table on a June evening and said, "Marcus, if you do this with me, I will build something worth handing down. And when the time comes, it's yours." I believed him. I believed him because I had watched him work for 4 years and understood that he was a man who said things he meant. I believed him because he looked at me the way he looked when something was serious and not to be taken lightly. And I believed him because I was 18 years old and my father had never given me a reason not to trust him. I spent 30 years building that company with my own hands. 30 years of 5 in the morning starts in every season. Frost on the truck windshields in February, 100-degree heat indexes in August, the cold of an October rainstorm when the schedule doesn't let you stop. 30 years of learning every piece of equipment, managing every crew, writing every payroll, fielding every difficult client. 30 years of watching the company grow from 11 employees and 3 trucks to 62 employees and a fleet that took up half a city block. 30 years of believing, every single one of those mornings, that what I was building would be mine. When my parents retired last spring, they called a family meeting. My father stood up and said they were splitting the company 50-50 between my brother Derek and me. Derek, who had left for college at 18 and never come back to work. Derek, who visited the company maybe 5 or 6 times in the past 20 years. Derek, who had never driven one of our trucks, never written a crew schedule, never stayed on a job site until 9 at night because a client had a complaint and the crew needed direction. I said, "Dad, you promised me this company." My father looked at me across the table and said, "We never promised you anything, Marcus. You've been paid a fair salary as an employee. Derek is family too. This is an equal division." My mother nodded. Derek looked at the table. I sat for a moment in the specific silence of a man who has just been told that 30 years of his life were a misunderstanding. Then I said I needed time to think. And then, 2 weeks later, I walked away from the company I had built. My family called it a tantrum. This is what actually happened. My father, Gary Webb, started the business when I was 7 years old. He had worked for a commercial grounds maintenance company for over a decade, learned everything there was to learn, and decided he could do it better on his own. He was not a man who talked much about his ambitions. That is not a characteristic of the men in our family, which turned out to be part of the problem. But the ambition was real and the work ethic behind it was extraordinary. He borrowed $12,000 from my grandfather, bought 2 used trucks and a trailer's worth of equipment, and started knocking on doors in the residential neighborhoods east of Knoxville. The first year was brutal in the way that first years of small businesses are brutal. He worked every job himself, sometimes with one helper, sometimes alone. He came home past dark most nights. The money was thin and the uncertainty was constant, and my mother Linda managed the household finances with a discipline that I only fully appreciated as an adult, stretching every dollar, making decisions about what could wait and what could not, keeping the household functional while the business found its footing. I was a child, so I have only a child's memory of those first years. But I remember the texture of it. My father leaving before I woke up, coming home with grass stains on his forearms, and the particular smell of someone who has worked outside all day in the July heat. I remember my mother doing the bookkeeping at the kitchen table after dinner, the adding machine making its rhythmic clacking sound. I remember sitting nearby doing homework and understanding, without anyone explaining it, that we were in the middle of something that mattered. I remember the pride in our house when the company got its first commercial contract, a shopping center on the east side of Knoxville. My father came home that evening with a bottle of wine he couldn't really afford, and my parents toasted each other over the dinner table, and I understood, even at 10 years old, that something significant had happened, that the thing my father was building was becoming real in a new way. By the time I was in high school, Webb Grounds and Maintenance was a genuine company. 8 employees, a growing roster of commercial and residential clients across Knox County. My father had developed a reputation for reliability and quality that was bringing him contracts he hadn't had to chase, because satisfied clients were recommending him. He had moved beyond the stage of daily survival into something that looked like sustainable growth. I worked summers and some weekends from the time I was 14. Not in a token way. My father did not believe in token involvement. I was assigned to a crew like any other crew member. I mowed. I trimmed. I loaded and unloaded debris. I learned how the equipment worked and how to maintain it and what happened when it didn't get maintained properly. I was not there to observe. I was there to work, and I worked, and I was good at it in a way that felt native rather than learned. My brother Derek is 8 years younger than me. By the time he was old enough to understand what the business was, I was already embedded in it as something more than a summer helper. The family dynamic around the company was already established. I was the one who was in it, and Derek was the one who was not. He helped sometimes, the way a younger kid helps, occasional weekend work, enough to say he'd done it, not enough to know anything. He was different from me in the ways that mattered most. Academic, socially ambitious, oriented toward a life that had nothing to do with grass and equipment and early mornings in the East Tennessee heat. Derek was genuinely excellent at school. Strong test scores, strong grades, the kind of profile that attracts scholarship attention. He had options I had not cultivated, and he knew it, and he pursued them. He left for the University of Tennessee at 18 on a full academic scholarship. Business degree, then an MBA. Moved to Nashville after graduation. Got a position at a commercial finance firm. Built a career there over 2 decades. Became by most accounts successful in the world he had chosen. He came back to Knoxville for holidays and occasional family events. He had almost no involvement with the company beyond those passing visits. I don't say any of this critically. He made his choices, and I made mine. He chose the life that fit him. I chose the life that fit me. The difference, and this is the difference that makes everything else in this story what it is that my choices were made in explicit, repeated, witnessed exchange for something specific. Derek's choices were simply his choices. Mine were a transaction, and the terms of that transaction were clear to me for 30 years. The summer I graduated high school, I was offered a partial academic scholarship to a regional college 2 hours away. It wasn't a prestigious institution, but it was real. I had good enough grades, decent test scores, and a guidance counselor who had pushed me harder than I pushed myself and believed the offer was worth taking seriously. My father found out about the scholarship offer and asked to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us, a weeknight in June, the windows open, the sound of the neighborhood coming in from outside. He told me what he was building. Not in grandiose terms. My father was not a grandiose man, but in specific, practical ones. He told me the company was at a stage where it could grow significantly if he had the right person beside him, someone who understood the operation from the inside, someone he could trust completely with every part of it. He said he had watched me work for 4 years, and he knew what I was capable of, and he believed I was that person. He said, "If you come into this with me fully, not summers, not weekends, but all the way, I will make sure this company is yours when the time comes. You have my word on that." He did not hedge. He did not say, "probably," or "if things go well," or "assuming your brother doesn't want it." He made a statement, and he looked at me across the kitchen table with the kind of directness that I associated with seriousness, and I took it as serious. I turned down the scholarship that week. I told the college by phone. I told my guidance counselor in person. She was disappointed, but not surprised. She had seen enough kids from working families choose the family over the institution to recognize the shape of the decision. I have never regretted the decision in the way some people might expect me to regret it. Not because it didn't cost me things. It cost me things I still cannot fully enumerate. The alternative life I didn't live, the credentials I didn't accumulate, the independence that comes from building something entirely separate from your family. But I went into the work with my whole self and found that I was genuinely good at it, which matters more than people sometimes acknowledge. Competence at something you care about is its own form of dignity. I learned every position in the company, not in the theoretical way that management schools teach operations, but physically, practically, in the mud and the machinery. I drove trucks for the first 3 years. Crew leader at 22. Operations manager at 28. When the company had grown to the point where my father's direct oversight of daily work was no longer possible and someone needed to hold the whole operation in their head and make it function. By my mid-30s, I was effectively running Webb grounds. Not in the official sense. My father was still the owner, still made major decisions, still signed the papers. But the operational reality of the company was mine. I held the client relationships. I managed the crews, all of them, across every contract. I negotiated with vendors. I made equipment decisions. I hired and I fired and I stayed late, and I came in on weekends when something went wrong, and I was the person the office called when anything required judgment. The company grew. When I joined at 18, we had 11 employees and 3 trucks. When my parents announced their retirement, we had 62 employees, a fleet of vehicles, contracts covering a significant portion of the commercial properties in Knox County, and a reputation that had been built, almost entirely, by my presence and the relationships I had developed and maintained over 3 decades. My father acknowledged this, in his way, not always with the specificity or formality that might have served us both better, but he acknowledged it. At family dinners over the years, in front of relatives and friends, he would say things like, "Marcus runs the show now. I just sign the checks." He said it with evident pride. At a family event when I was in my late 30s, he told an old friend of his that the business was going to be Marcus's legacy, that he was building it to hand off. My mother said similar things in different company. To my wife during my first marriage. To her friends. To relatives at gatherings I was and was not present for. The promise wasn't made once. It was made in variations, across decades, in front of different witnesses at different moments. That is what I need people to understand. This was not a single conversation that could be misremembered or misinterpreted. It was a pattern, a consistent, repeated, public pattern of statements made across 30 years by 2 people who were asking me, implicitly and explicitly, to organize my life around a future they were describing. And I organized my life accordingly. My father told my Uncle Ray, at a family Christmas dinner when I was 36, that the business was Marcus's legacy and that he was building it to hand off. He said it unprompted, in the context of a broader conversation about the company's growth, and Ray took it as settled fact. He has told me since that he never once doubted, until the family meeting, that I would inherit the company outright. My father told a family friend named Harold, at a backyard gathering when I was in my late 30s, that he had made sure Marcus understood every part of the operation because someday it was all going to be his. Harold remembered this specifically when I called him months after the family meeting. He said my father had said it with evident pride and certainty. My mother said similar things to my wife during my first marriage, to her book club friends, to my aunt on my father's side, who still quietly acknowledges it happened even as she urges me to make peace. These were not whispers or implications. They were direct, confident statements made in public by 2 people who had every reason to know what those statements would mean to me. I passed on opportunities that would have made no sense to pass on if I had known the real situation. In my mid-30s, a regional landscaping group operating across 3 states approached me about a director-level operations role. Good salary, meaningful equity stake, legitimate long-term future. I turned it down without extended deliberation because I was building something for myself at Webb, or believed I was. I mentioned it to my father when it happened. He didn't advise me either way. He simply nodded and said he was glad I was staying. In my early 40s, a former client of Webb's tried to recruit me to run a new commercial grounds operation he was launching. He had seen my work for years, trusted my judgment, and believed I could build something real for him. I declined that too. Webb was where my future was. I was not going anywhere. Those decisions made sense in the context of the understanding I believed existed between my family and me. They make no sense at all, and I mean no sense. I mean they are professionally and financially indefensible, in the context of what my parents announced at the family meeting in April. The meeting itself was organized by my parents. They called me 3 weeks in advance, asked me to clear my Saturday morning, said they wanted to have a family conversation about the future of the company. They asked Derek to fly in from Nashville. They framed it to me as a succession discussion, which I took to mean the formalization of what had always been the plan. I want to be careful here about what I assumed and why, because it matters. I assumed the meeting was about how, not whether. I assumed my parents were going to sit down with their attorney's guidance and work through the mechanics of a transfer, timeline, valuation, any buyout components that might be appropriate, how to handle taxes, how to ensure the company's continuity during the transition period. I had thought about this conversation for years. I had a rough sense of what I wanted to propose in terms of structure. I was prepared. What I was not prepared for was the meeting that actually happened. I arrived at my parents' house on a Saturday morning in April. Derek was already there, which struck me as slightly unusual. He did not often make the trip to Knoxville, and when he did, he typically didn't arrive before me. We sat around the dining room table. My parents brought coffee in the good mugs they used when things were formal. It felt different from how that table usually felt. My father spoke first. He thanked Derek and me for being there. He said he and my mother had decided the time had come to step back from active involvement in Webb grounds. He expressed pride in what the company had become and gratitude to both of his sons. He said the company had been the center of their family's life for 4 decades, and they wanted to ensure it stayed in the family. And then he said they had decided the fairest arrangement was an equal ownership split between my brother Derek and me, 50% each. He said it the way you say something you have practiced, even-toned, steady. He had thought carefully about how to deliver this, and he was delivering it the way he had planned. I sat for a moment in the quality of silence that follows something that doesn't match what you were expecting. I said, "Dad, that's not what you told me." He said he didn't understand what I meant. I said, "You have told me, for 30 years, that this company would be mine when you retired. You said it at this table. You said it in front of family members. You said it in front of people outside the family. I turned down a scholarship when I was 18 because you made me that promise. I turned down other opportunities because I believed it was real." My mother said, "Marcus, I don't think that's quite how he said it." My father said, "You have been a valued employee, son. You've been compensated fairly. I don't know where you got the impression that." "Dad," I kept my voice even. "Uncle Ray was sitting in this house at Christmas 11 years ago when you told him the business was my legacy. You said you were building it to hand off to me. He remembers it. He will tell you he remembers it." My father looked at my mother. Something passed between them. I had the sense of a conversation they had already had, a response they had already prepared. My mother said, "We have always wanted to be fair to both of our boys." Derek said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the surface of the table in a way that told me he was uncomfortable but had decided to stay quiet rather than weigh in. I said, "Derek wasn't here. Derek hasn't been here. He has visited 5 or 6 times in 20 years. I ran this company. I built these client relationships. I managed these crews. Every year of growth this company has had for the past 15 years is because of work I did, decisions I made, problems I solved." My father said, "You were well compensated for all of that." I looked at him. He held my gaze. And I understood, in that moment, that we had arrived at the position he had prepared, that the work I had done was employment, not investment, that the salary I had earned was full payment, that nothing beyond that was owed. I said I needed time to think. I said it as calmly as I could manage. I stood up, thanked them for the coffee, and went home. I sat in my truck in my parents' driveway for several minutes before I started it. I was trying to identify what I was feeling. It wasn't quite anger, not yet. Anger is too hot a word for what I felt in those first minutes. It was something closer to the specific disorientation of a man who has just been told that the map he has been navigating by for 30 years does not correspond to any actual territory. The 2 weeks that followed were the most difficult of my professional life. I spoke with an attorney that first week, a business attorney I trusted, who I had worked with on company matters before and who understood the company's structure. He listened to everything. He asked careful questions. He was honest with me in the way a good attorney is honest, not telling me what I wanted to hear, but telling me what I needed to know. He said, "Without a written document, a formal succession agreement, a buy-sell arrangement, anything on paper with signatures, the verbal promises, while real and potentially provable through witness testimony, were unlikely to hold up if my parents chose to contest them. A verbal promise about a business inheritance, contested by the people who made it, is a difficult case to win. My parents had the legal authority to structure the transfer however they chose. They had chosen 50-50. Legally, it was their right." He was not unsympathetic. He said the situation was common in family businesses. He said the assumption that spoken words between family members carry the same weight as written contracts had destroyed more families than he could count. I called my Uncle Ray. He confirmed, without hesitation, what I already knew he would confirm. He remembered the Christmas dinner conversation. He said my father had been clear and that he had never, in all the years since, doubted that the business was going to Marcus. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't understand what had changed. I called my father one more time, privately, the second week. I asked for a conversation without my mother and without Derek. He agreed to that much. I did not come to that conversation asking for everything. I had thought carefully about what was reasonable to ask for, and I came in with a proposal. Not 100%, not the arrangement I believed had been promised, but an arrangement that reflected the reality of what I had contributed versus what Derek had contributed. I asked for a tiered ownership structure, perhaps 70% for me and 30% for Derek, with a buyout mechanism over 5 years so Derek would be made whole without having to remain in a business he had no knowledge of or relationship with. I framed it as fair. I framed it as proportional. I framed it as the kind of arrangement that any outside business advisor would recommend when one party has built an operation and the other has been absent from it for 2 decades. My father listened. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the decision was made. He said it without heat, almost gently. The decision was made. I drove home, and I sat with that for the rest of the day. And then I made my own decision. I walked away from Webb Grounds in May. I gave 30 days notice to the company, not to my parents specifically, but to the company, because it had 62 employees and dozens of active client contracts, and I was not going to punish them for a decision my parents had made. I trained whoever needed training. I documented systems and processes I had been carrying in my head for years and had never needed to write down because I was always there to answer the question. I briefed the crew leaders one by one. I prepared the operations manager I was handing things to as thoroughly as I could in 4 weeks. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. I did not sabotage a single client relationship or employee arrangement. I did not go to clients and tell them what had happened. That was not their concern, and I was not willing to use them to relieve my own feelings. I did what I had always done. I acted like a professional. I protected the thing I had spent 30 years building even as I was being forced to leave it. My family called it a tantrum. Derek told mutual relatives, cousins, our father's siblings, family friends who had known us both since childhood, that I was being selfish, that I had always thought I was more important than the rest of the family, that I was trying to cut him out of his inheritance. The framing was efficient. I was the one who had walked away, which made me the one who had acted. The fact that something had been done to me first was not part of the version that circulated. My mother called me twice. Her voice the first time was the voice of a woman who was genuinely distressed and who wanted the distress to end. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this to them. She said it felt like I was punishing the family for a business decision. She said she hoped I would take some time and come back to the conversation with a clearer head. I told her I had a very clear head. I told her I had given 30 years of my working life to their company on the basis of a promise they were now denying, and that walking away was the only response I had that preserved my self-respect. She cried. We hung up. A cousin sent me a message telling me to think about my parents' feelings. An aunt on my father's side, who had been in that same room at Christmas dinner years earlier when my father told his brother the business was my legacy, told me she hoped I would find a way to make peace with the situation. She did not dispute what had been said that night. She just hoped I would make peace with it. No one, in any of these conversations, addressed what had been promised to me. I have been thinking, in the years since all of this happened, about what it means to believe something for a very long time. I believed, for 30 years, that my father's word was his word, that the family's word was the family's word, that what had been said in front of witnesses at dinner tables and in backyards over decades was real and binding in the way that all serious things between people who trust each other are real and binding. That my life's central professional decision, staying, building, sacrificing, declining every outside opportunity that came my way, was anchored in something that existed, something that was as solid as the company itself. I am forced now to consider the possibility that what I believed was real and what was real are not the same thing. And sitting with that, actually sitting with it, not just acknowledging it intellectually, but feeling the weight of it, has been one of the harder experiences of my adult life. There are a few versions of what might have happened, and I have turned all of them over more times than is probably healthy. The first version, my parents made a promise they fully intended to keep, and they changed their minds somewhere near the end. Perhaps because Derek began showing more interest in the company as a financial asset when retirement approached, perhaps because they didn't want to appear to favor one son over another in the final accounting of their lives, perhaps because the idea of treating the company purely as a legacy gift to Marcus felt, in the end, like it was leaving Derek with nothing. I can understand this version. It doesn't excuse what happened, but I can understand the human mechanics of it. People who mean well, who made commitments in the confidence of a future that looked simpler than it turned out to be, who arrived at the end of their working lives and couldn't find a way to honor an old promise without creating a new conflict. The second version, my parents made statements over the years that they experienced as general expressions of intent, optimistic, conditional, not meant to be received as formal commitments, and I received those statements as something more binding than they intended. In this version, the failure is one of communication rather than breach. They said things they didn't fully mean in the way I heard them. I built my life on a foundation they didn't realize they were laying. No one lied. No one betrayed. There was just a gap between what was said and what was understood that 3 decades of silence allowed to grow into a catastrophic misalignment. The third version, my parents understood exactly what they were saying and what I was receiving, and they hoped the situation would resolve itself, that Derek would never want a share of the company, or that I would never ask for formal acknowledgement of the promise, or that they would find some mechanism before the end that let them be fair to both sons without having to have the conversation they were clearly not prepared to have. And then the end arrived, and the situation had not resolved itself, and they chose the clean option over the honest one. I don't know which of these is true. I may never know, and I have had to accept, over the past year, that not knowing is something I have to live with rather than something I can resolve by thinking about it harder. What I do know, what I am certain of, in the way you can only be certain of things you experience directly, is this. I was told, clearly and repeatedly, over 30 years, by 2 people whose word I trusted completely, that the company was going to be mine. I made major life decisions in reliance on that. I have witnesses, and when the moment came, I was told I must have misunderstood. That reframing is the part of this I find hardest to hold. Not the financial loss, though the financial loss is real and meaningful. A 50% stake in a company I built is worth a great deal of money, and I am in my late 40s without it. Not even the loss of the company itself, though leaving was genuinely painful in ways I didn't fully anticipate. I had spent 30 years caring about those employees, those client relationships, those trucks, and that equipment, and the reputation we had built one satisfied contract at a time. Walking away from all of it felt like setting down something I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. What I find hardest is the revision. The way my parents, in that dining room and in every conversation since, have inhabited a version of events in which no promise was ever made, in which I was simply a well-compensated employee with inflated expectations, in which the fair thing was a split that treated 30 years of daily presence and sacrifice exactly the same as 20 years of deliberate, self-chosen absence. People who have heard this story, when I tell it, ask me about Derek. They want to know whether I blame him, whether we still speak. Derek is not the villain of this story. I want to be clear about that, even though being clear about it cost me something. He was handed something he didn't ask for and did not fully understand the cost of. He arrived at that dining room table in April and received a gift he had not earned, but he did not steal it. It was given to him by the people who had the authority to give it. That authority was legal, if not moral. Derek had no obligation to refuse. We talk occasionally. He is awkward about it in a way that tells me he understands more than he says. He has been decent to me, in his way, not warm exactly, not able to be warm given the circumstances, but decent. He has not been triumphant or dismissive. He is a man who received something at someone else's expense and knows it, and is living with that in whatever way he has worked out for himself. I don't know if that will ever be enough for me to feel comfortable around him again. I am honest about that. Decency is not the same as justice. My parents and I speak rarely. My mother calls on holidays. The conversations are short and careful, conducted on a surface we have both agreed not to break through. My father and I have not had a real conversation since the phone call where he told me the decision was made. I don't know how to have a real conversation with someone who has looked at 30 years of my life and declined to acknowledge what they meant. I started my own company 8 months after leaving Web grounds. Small operation. Me and 4 former Web employees who left when I did. People who had worked alongside me for years and who understood, without needing to be told, what had happened. We have a handful of commercial contracts and are building a client list from scratch. I have relationships in this industry that go back 2 decades, and some of those relationships have followed me. Several of the clients I built at Web have moved their contracts to my new operation. Not all of them. Some have stayed, out of loyalty to Gary Webb's original company or out of inertia, but enough to give me a foundation. It is not where I expected to be at 47. I had expected, at 47, to own a 60-employee company with a fleet and established contracts and 30 years of hard-won reputation sitting behind me like a foundation I had earned one season at a time. I had expected to be stepping into the full weight of the thing I had been building alongside my father since I was 18 years old, able finally to put my own name on it in the official sense rather than just the operational one. Instead, I am starting over. That is the thing I am still working out how to feel. Starting over at 47 is not impossible. I know that. I am not prone to self-pity, or I try not to be. But starting over at 47, when you should not have had to start over, when you were not supposed to start over, when the reason you are starting over is that someone looked at 30 years of your life and said we never promised you anything. That particular version of starting over carries a specific weight that I am still learning to carry without letting it become bitterness I cannot put down. I am building something with my name on it from the beginning. Something that cannot be handed to someone else at a dining room table by people who have the legal authority to rewrite what a man's working life was worth. I am not at peace with what happened. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to wrap this in a lesson about how it all worked out or how losing the company freed me for something better. Maybe that will be true someday. It is not true yet. What is true is that I am functioning. That I get up in the mornings and drive to a job site and manage people who trust me and make decisions that I believe are right. That the work itself, the actual work, the equipment and the crews and the client relationships, has not lost its value to me even though the context around it has been catastrophically rearranged. What I am is clear. Clear about what I gave. Clear about what was said. Clear about the witnesses who heard it said. Clear about the decisions I made because of what was said and what those decisions cost me and what they would have been worth if the promise had been kept. My parents are still running Web grounds, or trying to, with Derek flying in from Nashville once a month and struggling with an operation he has never actually worked. The crew I trained is running things day to day because without that crew the company would have no operational continuity at all. Several of the clients I built relationships with over 2 decades have reached out to me in the months since I left. Some of them are now my clients. Not because I solicited them, I was careful about that, but because they had relationships with me, not with a company name, and they followed the relationship. I don't know if my parents understand what they lost the day they handed that table split to Derek and waited to see if I would accept it. Not just me, though they lost me, genuinely and deeply, in a way that I don't think any of us have finished understanding. But the thing I represented. The 30 years of knowledge and relationship and operational competence that walked out of the building with me and is now, a few miles away, building something new. What I want, what I have wanted throughout all of this, and what I have never been given, is not the company. The company is gone to me now. What I want is for someone in my family to say, "We made you a promise. You kept your end. We didn't keep ours." That is the truth of it, and it has always been the truth of it. And saying it out loud would not undo what happened, but it would at least mean that the thing that happened was named honestly rather than buried under a version of events no one who was there actually believes. I don't think I will ever hear those words. But they are true regardless of whether they are spoken. 30 years do not disappear because someone at a table declines to acknowledge them. A promise does not unmake itself because the person who made it finds it inconvenient to remember. The truth of what happened between my family and me exists whether it is named or not. I gave 30 years. I turned down a scholarship. I turned down careers in my 30s and 40s that would have made financial sense if I had known then what I was forced to learn at a dining room table in April. I drove trucks in the cold rain and managed crews in the summer heat and stayed late when no one else would and cared about that operation with a depth of investment that only comes from believing the thing is yours, from being told, clearly and in front of witnesses, by the people who built it, that it is yours. It was supposed to be mine. I am 47 years old. I am starting over. And I am building something that will have my name on it from the very beginning. Something that cannot be handed to someone else at a dining room table. Something that cannot be taken from me by people who look at 30 years of my life and say, "We never promised you anything. Watch me build it anyway." Have you ever been passed over for something you were promised by your own family? Have you ever sacrificed an opportunity, a scholarship, a career, a different life, because you trusted someone's word, and that word turned out to mean nothing when the moment came? Have you ever been told the promise didn't exist after you had spent decades living as though it did, building as though it did, giving up as though it did? Share your experience in the comments. You are not alone in this. The people who make promises inside families, where the assumption of trust makes documentation feel unnecessary, and then deny those promises when honoring them becomes inconvenient. They count on the silence that follows. They count on the person who was wronged being too proud, or too private, or too afraid of being called bitter, to say clearly what happened. I am not staying silent. What happened to me was real. The promise was real. The 30 years were real. And the betrayal, the calm, rehearsed, carefully delivered betrayal in a dining room on a Saturday morning in April, was real. If you believe that a man who gives 30 years to a family business, who turns down a scholarship at 18, who turns down other careers because he trusted a promise, who manages crews and writes payroll and stays late and builds something real, deserves more than half a share split with a brother who was gone for 20 of those years, hit that like button and subscribe. Because a promise is a promise, and pretending it was never made doesn't unmake it. It just tells you everything you needed to know about the person who made it, and the kind of people they turned out to be when the cost of keeping their word finally arrived. Hashtag they gave it to my brother.